Have you ever smiled while someone intentionally trampled on your self-esteem? Not because you were weak, but because you knew you held the power to crush their entire world with a single snap of your fingers? A folding plastic chair placed next to a foul-smelling trash can at a multi-million-dollar gala was my father's way of defining my worth. But he is about to learn a lesson. Never judge a silent wolf. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Vivian Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has entirely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to operate and pay our hardworking staff. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can afford their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment below. My name is Mackenzie Alvarado. I am 34 years old. People often look right past me. And honestly, I have always preferred it that way. I wear unassuming clothes, keep my expressions entirely neutral, and choose to observe rather than speak. But behind this plain, quiet facade lies a mind that never stops processing. I am constantly analyzing, calculating, and dissecting the world around me, stripping away the polished surfaces to see the raw, ugly machinery underneath. That machinery was never more apparent than within my own family. My father, Hector Alvarado, has always worshipped at the altar of glitz, glamour, and traditional ladders of success. For him, a person's worth is not measured by their character, but entirely determined by the designer brand of their suit, the make of their luxury sedan, and the prestigious title printed on their heavy cardstock business card. Naturally, his entire universe revolves around my older brother Julian. Julian is everything my father ever wanted and more. He is a polished, fiercely ambitious, and incredibly arrogant business executive. He knows exactly whose hand to shake, whose ego to stroke, and whose back to step on. He is the golden child, the undeniable, singular source of Hector's pride. Tonight was the ultimate, sickening manifestation of my father's shallow dreams. We were gathered at a lavish, exclusive honor gala held inside the grand ballroom of a magnificent five-star hotel in downtown Austin, Texas. The sheer opulence of the room was suffocating. The high ceiling dripped with massive crystal chandeliers that fractured the light into a million blinding sparks. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos glided across the thick carpets, ensuring that champagne flowed like a never-ending river of liquid gold. We were all summoned here to celebrate Julian. Tonight, he was officially being promoted to the coveted position of senior partner at a massive, globally recognized financial technology conglomerate. It was a multi-million-dollar networking event disguised as a family celebration, filled to the brim with the city's political and corporate elite. I stepped into the glittering, noisy hall wearing a simple navy dress. It was impeccably neat, but it clearly lacked the exorbitant designer pedigree of the silk and satin gowns swishing all around me. As I walked deeper into the room, the impeccably dressed guests looked right through me as if I were made of glass. I was a smudge on their pristine canvas, a glitch in their perfect system. I made my way toward the front of the room, scanning the heavy velvet-draped VIP tables situated right below the main stage. I checked the beautiful gold-embossed place cards one by one. I checked table 1. I checked table 2. I checked table 3. I kept walking, checking all the way to table 10. My name was nowhere to be found among the important people. A quiet resignation settled heavily over my shoulders, mingling with a very familiar dull ache in my chest. I began to wander toward the outer edges of the room, moving away from the warmth of the spotlight and the center of attention. That was when I finally saw it, tucked away in the darkest, most ignored, and most dimly lit corner of the massive ballroom, right next to the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen and the chaotic busboy station. There was a large, gray, foul-smelling plastic garbage can used by the catering staff to scrape half-eaten gourmet meals off dirty porcelain plates. Next to that reeking trash can sat a single, shabby, gray folding plastic chair. It was the exact kind of cheap, uncomfortable chair you would find at a low-budget backyard barbecue, and resting squarely on its hard plastic seat was a piece of torn, crumpled white paper. My name, Mackenzie Alvarado, was scribbled across it in hasty, messy, almost angry handwriting. It was not a careless mistake by the event planners. It was a deliberate, meticulously planned message. Before I could fully process the harsh physical manifestation of my exile, a booming, jovial voice cut sharply through the sophisticated background hum of the gala. "There, that corner is best suited for a wandering computer repairman." I slowly turned my head. My father, Hector, was standing just a few feet away, casually holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive whiskey. He was surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy, silver-haired businessmen who hung on to his every word. He pointed his index finger directly at me, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips. "Don't let her dust dirty your tailored suits, gentlemen," he added, raising his voice just enough to ensure the nearby guests could hear every single syllable. The group of powerful men immediately erupted into a chorus of shallow, sycophantic laughter. The sound echoed in my ears, sharp, grating, and deliberately designed to tear at the very fabric of my pride. Hector looked right at me, his eyes completely devoid of any paternal warmth or basic human empathy. He looked at me not as his flesh-and-blood daughter, but as a shameful, embarrassing secret he was finally putting in its rightful place, right next to the garbage. The expected reaction from any normal, humiliated daughter in that exact scenario would have been a dramatic exit. The wealthy businessmen surrounding Hector eagerly anticipated a sudden outburst of tears, a flushed face, or the sight of me turning on my heels and running out of the grand ballroom in absolute shame. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the weak link of the Alvarado family break under the heavy weight of their collective judgment. Instead, I did the one thing that entirely short-circuited their arrogant expectations. I smiled. It was not a forced, trembling smile trying to mask deep pain, but a genuine, remarkably peaceful expression. I simply nodded at my father, walked directly over to the designated corner, pulled the flimsy gray plastic chair away from the wall, and sat down. The squeak of the cheap plastic legs scraping against the marble floor before hitting the edge of the carpet was completely drowned out by the surrounding chatter. But the nearby guests who had witnessed the exchange stared at me in sheer disbelief. A woman draped in a heavy emerald silk gown wrinkled her nose in profound disgust, whispering frantically to her husband as she pulled her evening shawl tighter around her shoulders, creating a safe physical distance between her designer outfit and the foul-smelling garbage can. I settled comfortably into the rigid seat, leaning back as if it were a leather throne. The pungent odor of discarded truffles, stale wine, and half-eaten caviar wafted from the massive gray bin right beside my elbow, but it did not bother me. It was merely the scent of their extravagant waste. Sitting in this dark corner, my mind drifted back 14 years to the exact moment this massive chasm between my father and me had been permanently cemented. I was 20 years old at the time, standing in the center of his immaculate, mahogany-paneled home office. That day, I firmly placed my university withdrawal forms on his pristine desk, calmly informing him that I was abandoning the prestigious corporate finance track he had so painstakingly mapped out for my entire life. I told him I was switching to systems engineering. I can still vividly recall the violent shade of crimson that flooded Hector's face. To him, finance was the ultimate language of kings, the only acceptable path to absolute power and societal respect. Engineering, in his narrow, status-obsessed mind, was blue-collar labor dressed up in a laboratory coat. He stood up, slamming his heavy fist onto the wooden desk, and delivered the verdict that would define our relationship for the next decade and a half. If you choose to be a wrench-turning mechanic instead of a master of capital, then you are nothing but a worthless throwaway to this family. I had walked out of his office that day without shedding a single tear, and I had never looked back. Since then, they genuinely believed I spent my days crawling under office desks, untangling dusty Ethernet cables, and resetting forgotten passwords for frustrated middle managers. They thought I was a wandering computer repairman, barely scraping by on minimum wage. The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. I was not a desk IT worker. My actual title was Chief Architect of Cyber Defense at the Aegis Vanguard Directorate. The Vanguard was an independent, top-secret technological intelligence organization that did not exist on any public government registry or corporate tax form. We were the invisible shield protecting the modern world. My daily responsibilities did not involve fixing broken printers. They involved designing the impenetrable, heavily encrypted security frameworks that safeguarded the entire national power grid, secured the classified communications of the intelligence community, and protected the private financial reservoirs of the world's most powerful billionaires. I held the digital keys to empires, possessing the capability to dismantle entire economies or bring massive corporations to their knees before my morning coffee. Yet for 14 agonizingly long years, I chose to maintain my fabricated cover story. I embraced the mundane identity of a low-level desk worker because it served as the perfect sociological experiment. It taught me a brutal but necessary truth about human nature and familial bonds. I realized early on that those who only measure your value by the impressive title printed on your business card or the heavy zeros in your bank account are entirely incapable of truly loving you. If I had revealed my true status, my father would have undoubtedly paraded me around like a prized show pony, just as he did with my brother. I preferred the honest cruelty of his rejection over the fake, conditional affection he would have offered my title. The contrast in the room was a masterpiece of tragic irony. Over by the brightly lit center stage, Julian was in his element. He was aggressively working the room, flashing his perfectly bleached teeth, aggressively shaking hands with local politicians, and eagerly clinking his crystal champagne flute against the glasses of wealthy real estate developers. He was desperately peddling his influence, begging for their continued investment and validation, completely dependent on their approval to maintain his fragile sense of superiority. Meanwhile, I remained seated in the shadows next to the discarded food, completely invisible to the powerful elite of Austin. I casually reached into my small purse and pulled out my plain, unassuming smartphone. The screen was dark, but a heavily encrypted application ran silently in the background. I opened it, my eyes rapidly scanning a complex, scrolling sequence of binary code. Just 30 minutes prior, while Julian was practicing his arrogant acceptance speech in the mirror, an anonymous international hacking syndicate had attempted to breach the central firewall of a massive global logistics network. I had quietly rewritten the defense protocols from the back of a taxi on my way to the hotel. I tapped the screen once, executing the final command to permanently lock the intruders out and incinerate their tracking nodes. The screen flashed a quiet, glowing green confirmation message. Sitting right there beside the garbage, completely ignored by my own flesh and blood, I had just successfully thwarted a catastrophic cyber attack and quietly saved roughly $3 billion. I locked my phone, slipped it back into my purse, and looked up, watching my father proudly pat Julian on the back, entirely oblivious to the fact that a true apex predator was currently resting in his designated corner of exile. The ballroom was currently operating at its absolute zenith of self-congratulation and manufactured glory. Up on the brilliantly illuminated main stage, Julian stood behind a heavy acrylic podium, gripping its edges with an air of practiced, supreme authority. He was in the middle of delivering a meticulously rehearsed, deeply arrogant acceptance speech. His voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, echoing off the crystal chandeliers as he spoke of corporate synergy, aggressive market dominance, and his relentless visionary drive to conquer the financial sector. Down in the front row, directly in the blast zone of the stage lights, Hector sat with his chest puffed out so far, the buttons of his tailored tuxedo strained against the expensive fabric. He was beaming, radiating a smug, overwhelming satisfaction, looking around the room as if he had personally orchestrated the creation of the universe, and was now graciously accepting the applause of his loyal subjects. The surrounding elite clapped exactly when prompted, raising their delicate crystal flutes of vintage champagne high into the air. From my isolated vantage point next to the foul-smelling garbage can in the dark corner of the room, the entire spectacle looked like a perfectly choreographed, utterly ridiculous play. Then, the meticulously curated atmosphere shattered. It did not happen slowly. It occurred with the sudden, violent shock of a physical blow. A frantic, chaotic commotion erupted from the grand lobby just beyond the heavy oak double doors. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that faced the downtown street, the distracted attendees suddenly witnessed an abrupt and terrifying shift in the night. A convoy of 6 pitch-black, heavily armored sport utility vehicles violently screeched to a halt right on the hotel's curved, pristine driveway. The massive tires wailed against the concrete, creating a sharp, alarming screech that easily pierced through the thick glass and completely drowned out the polite applause inside the ballroom. Before the terrified valet attendants could even react, the heavy doors of the armored vehicles flew open in terrifying synchronization. Over 24 private security contractors poured out onto the pavement. They were massive, imposing men, clad entirely in tactical black suits, moving with silent, terrifying military efficiency. In a matter of seconds, they stormed the hotel's grand entrance. They did not pause to politely ask the concierge for directions or present invitations to the front desk. They immediately fanned out, securing the outer perimeter, physically blocking the golden elevators, and taking up rigid, strategic positions at every single exit point of the grand ballroom. The hotel's own highly paid security staff simply froze in place, instantly recognizing that they were hopelessly outranked and outgunned by a private army operating on a completely different, untouchable level of authority. Inside the hall, the polite applause died a rapid, awkward death. Julian faltered mid-sentence, the sensitive microphone picking up his sudden, confused intake of breath. A wave of terrified, electrified whispers swept through the sea of silk, velvet, and diamonds like wildfire. The name was passed rapidly from mouth to ear, growing louder and more frantic with every passing second. It is him. Are you absolutely sure? It is Silas Thorne. Silas Thorne. The name alone carried the crushing weight of a sovereign nation. He was the undisputed titan of Silicon Valley, the most ruthlessly powerful technology billionaire on the continent. This was a man who single-handedly dictated global market trends before he even finished his morning coffee, a man whose private wealth easily rivaled the gross domestic product of several European countries combined. And crucially, he was the exact man Julian had spent the last 3 years desperately, pathetically, chasing. My brother had flown across the country multiple times, pulled every imaginable political favor, and practically begged high-level intermediaries for a mere 5-minute meeting to pitch an investment proposal to Thorne's holding company. Every single attempt had been met with deafening, humiliating silence. The sheer impossibility of his unannounced arrival sent the Alvarado men into a sudden frenzy of blind, ego-driven delusion. Up on the stage, Julian's initial shock melted rapidly into an expression of sheer, unadulterated triumph. His posture straightened as he genuinely convinced himself that his relentless networking had finally paid off, believing that the absolute titan of the tech industry had flown all the way to Austin, Texas, specifically to honor his promotion to senior partner. Down in the front row, Hector sprang from his velvet-lined seat like a coiled spring released from its trap. He frantically smoothed the wide lapels of his jacket, aggressively adjusted his silk tie, and practically shoved a prominent local city councilman out of his way. "Move aside. Clear the path," Hector snapped at the bewildered, wealthy guests, aggressively pushing his way toward the front of the stage to flank his golden son. Julian practically leapt off the elevated platform, landing right beside our father at the edge of the central red carpet. Together they formed a truly pathetic picture of eager sycophancy. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forcefully puffing out their chests and plastering on the most sickeningly eager, obsequious smiles I had ever witnessed in my entire life. They stood there vibrating with anticipation, excitedly whispering to each other as they rapidly rehearsed the perfect, flattering greeting they were about to deliver to the undisputed king of the corporate world. Then, the massive oak doors of the ballroom were forcefully shoved wide open by two towering security guards. The low hum of anxious, panicked chatter evaporated into the high ceiling instantly. The entire hall fell dead silent. The absolute quiet was so heavy it felt suffocating. Silas Thorne stepped over the threshold. He did not look like a man arriving to celebrate a joyful milestone. He wore a sharply tailored, midnight blue suit that conveyed pure, unyielding dominance, and his demeanor was colder than absolute zero. There was no polite, camera-ready smile on his face, no congratulatory gleam in his dark eyes, and his hands were entirely empty. He brought no wrapped gift, no embossed card, and absolutely no token of goodwill. He emanated an aura of absolute crushing authority, moving with the slow, deliberate stride of an apex predator that had just effortlessly breached an enclosure full of remarkably fragile, trembling prey. Every single camera flash ceased firing. Every breath in the expansive room was collectively held. All eyes remained hopelessly glued to the most powerful man in America as he began to stalk down the plush red carpet. Julian took a highly confident, eager step forward, stepping directly into the path of the approaching tech titan. He was absolutely certain that this was his ultimate moment of triumph. He spread his arms wide in a grand, practiced gesture of welcoming magnanimity, flashing that perfectly bright, commercial smile he routinely used to close massive, multi-million-dollar corporate deals. He had prepared for this exact interaction for 3 long years, rehearsing every single syllable to ensure he sounded both respectful and remarkably successful. "Mr. Thorne," Julian began, his voice booming through the silent room, dripping with forced warmth and heavily rehearsed charm. "What an absolute, unexpected honor. We are so incredibly thrilled that you could join us tonight to celebrate my promotion to—" He never even came close to finishing that sentence. Silas Thorne did not slow his pace by a single fraction of a second. He did not blink. He did not nod. He did not even turn his head 1 millimeter to acknowledge that another human being was speaking to him. Silas simply kept walking, his heavy footsteps thudding rhythmically and menacingly against the plush carpet. He moved directly past my brother as if Julian were nothing more than a wisp of invisible smoke drifting aimlessly through the heavily air-conditioned room. The physical breeze generated by the billionaire brushing past completely shattered Julian's poised, arrogant stance. My brother was left standing completely frozen, his mouth hanging foolishly open, and his arms awkwardly suspended in mid-air. He looked like a shattered statue of a defeated king. A few steps past the petrified figures of my father and brother, Silas came to a dead, sudden halt right in the exact center of the grand ballroom. The surrounding wealthy guests instinctively took half a step backward, physically intimidated by the sheer, crushing gravitational pull of his presence. Silas stood perfectly still, his chin raised slightly, and began to scan the expansive room. His gaze was utterly terrifying, as sharp and unforgiving as a polished steel blade. He methodically swept his dark eyes over the velvet-draped VIP tables, completely dismissing the glittering diamond necklaces, the custom-tailored tuxedos, and the desperate, pleading faces of the local elite who were silently praying he would look their way. The city mayor offered a timid nod. Silas looked right through him. The chief executive officer of a prominent bank raised his glass in a silent toast. Silas ignored him as if he were a plastic mannequin. He was clearly searching for a specific silhouette, hunting for a target that none of the wealthy attendees could possibly comprehend. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming thick, heavy, and absolutely agonizing. You could hear the faint, erratic ticking of a luxury wristwatch from 5 feet away. Then, his sharp eyes bypassed the brilliantly lit center stage entirely. His vision sliced through the dense crowd, moved past the towering, melting ice sculptures, completely ignored the flowing champagne towers, and locked dead onto the darkest, most neglected corner of the entire venue. He found his target. Silas did not hesitate for a single moment. He adjusted the cuff of his midnight blue jacket with a sharp, decisive flick of his wrist and began to move again. He took long, aggressive strides, marching straight toward the back of the hall. As he advanced, the dense crowd of arrogant socialites and powerful executives practically scrambled out of his way, parting frantically like the Red Sea, to create a wide, completely unobstructed path for the billionaire. They pressed themselves flat against the linen-covered tables, absolutely terrified of accidentally brushing against him and drawing his formidable wrath. He walked with immense, terrifying purpose, heading directly toward the chaotic busboy station. The contrast was incredibly jarring. The most powerful man in the country was marching away from the spotlight and walking directly toward a cart full of dirty, scraped porcelain plates. Silas finally stopped. He stood tall and rigid, his highly polished leather shoes resting just 2 inches away from the foul-smelling gray plastic garbage can. He looked down at the cheap, flimsy plastic folding chair I was occupying, and then, his piercing gaze locked directly onto my face. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Nobody dared to make a single sound. The powerful businessmen who had been loudly mocking me just 1 hour ago were now pale, their eyes darting nervously between the tech titan and the woman they had cruelly deemed a wandering computer repairman. When Silas finally spoke, his deep, resonant voice boomed violently through the dead, quiet hall. He did not need a microphone. His tone was laced with an icy, absolute fury that made the air temperature in the room feel as though it had instantly plummeted 20 degrees. "Mackenzie," Silas commanded, his voice echoing fiercely off the high, gilded ceiling. "Tell me you are currently executing a deep undercover mission, because if you are not, I am going to buy this entire hotel by tomorrow morning just to fire the person who seated you next to this pile of garbage." Those words struck the room like a physical shockwave. A collective, horrified gasp rippled forcefully through the hundreds of elite guests. Back near the edge of the main red carpet, Hector's jaw actually dropped wide open, his face draining of all color until it matched the pristine white tablecloths. His crystal glass of expensive whiskey slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a muted thud. Julian looked as though he had been turned to solid stone, his eyes wide with a potent mixture of utter confusion and dawning, paralyzing terror. The carefully constructed, elitist hierarchy of the entire evening collapsed into worthless dust in a matter of seconds. Frantic, panicked whispers immediately broke out among the crowd, sounding like a hive of disturbed bees. The wealthy socialites were completely bewildered, entirely unable to process why the absolute ruler of Silicon Valley was fiercely, publicly defending the plainly dressed woman sitting in the shadows. Sitting calmly amidst the explosive, suffocating tension, I did not flinch. I slowly crossed my legs, looked up at the furious billionaire towering over me, and offered him a remarkably soft, gentle smile. "Just a family experience, Silas," I replied smoothly, my voice completely calm and perfectly steady. Silas Thorne did not find my calm explanation amusing in the slightest. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking visibly beneath his sharp cheekbones. He slowly turned his head away from me and directed his attention back toward the brightly lit center stage, where Julian's vacant, oversized velvet armchair still sat like a mock throne waiting for its king. Silas did not speak. He merely raised his right hand and snapped his fingers once. The sharp sound echoed like a gunshot. Instantly, 4 of his massive black-clad security contractors broke their perimeter formation and marched with heavy, synchronized footsteps directly up the central steps of the main stage. They completely ignored the confused master of ceremonies and the trembling hotel staff. Without a single word of explanation, the 4 towering men gripped the thick, ornate wooden arms of the luxurious, custom-upholstered velvet armchair that had been exclusively reserved for my brother's grand coronation. They lifted it effortlessly into the air and carried it straight down the steps, marching it all the way across the expansive, dead-silent ballroom. They set the massive piece of luxury furniture down with a heavy, authoritative thud right next to the foul-smelling gray garbage can, completely dwarfing my pathetic plastic folding chair. Silas gestured toward the velvet throne with an open palm, silently demanding that I take the seat of honor. The sheer audacity of the gesture finally snapped Hector out of his paralyzed stupor. The protective, arrogant delusion that had fueled him for his entire life kicked into high gear. He could not process the reality unfolding before his eyes. His brain simply refused to accept that the undisputed master of the universe was bowing to his discarded daughter. Hector broke away from the crowd, his face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. He practically sprinted across the ballroom, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished marble floor as he desperately closed the distance. He was sweating profusely, his perfectly combed hair falling in disarray across his forehead. "Mr. Thorne, please, there has been a massive misunderstanding," Hector stammered frantically as he skidded to a halt just a few feet away from the billionaire's imposing figure. He waved his hands in the air, trying desperately to physically block Silas from looking at me. "You are completely mistaken, sir. I apologize profusely for this incredible embarrassment. This woman, she is just Mackenzie. She is my daughter, yes, but she is nobody. She is just a lowly, wandering information technology worker. She fixes broken keyboards and tangled wires. She is a throwaway, completely unworthy of your valuable time. Please let my son Julian escort you to the VIP table where you belong." Silas slowly turned his head to look at my father. The look of absolute, concentrated contempt on the billionaire's face was so intense it could have melted solid steel. He looked at Hector not as a fellow businessman, but as a disgusting, bothersome insect that had just crawled out of the trash. Silas took one deliberate, threatening step toward my father, using his towering height to cast a long, dark shadow over the older man's trembling frame. "A lowly information technology worker?" Silas repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that resonated through the absolute silence of the room. Every single guest strained their ears to hear the execution. "The woman you just had the monumental stupidity to call a throwaway is the Chief Architectural Security Officer of the Aegis Vanguard Directorate. She is the undisputed apex predator of the global digital battlefield. Last night, while you were busy picking out your pathetic little suits and practicing your shallow speeches, an international syndicate attempted to hijack my corporation's entire core infrastructure. They demanded a ransom of exactly $5 billion. If they had succeeded, my companies would have crashed, the markets would have bled, and people like you would have been ruined. But they did not succeed. Do you know why, Hector?" Silas paused, his eyes blazing with righteous fury as he pointed a long, accusatory finger directly at me. "Because the woman sitting next to this garbage can single-handedly tore their encryption to shreds, traced their physical locations, and completely annihilated their network before I even finished my evening coffee. She saved $5 billion and completely neutralized a global threat from the back of a moving taxi." The collective reaction of the ballroom was instantaneous and explosive. The absolute shock of the revelation hit the crowd like a tidal wave. Hundreds of guests simultaneously plunged their hands into their designer purses and the pockets of their tailored tuxedos. The dim, moody lighting of the elegant hall was suddenly pierced by the bright, chaotic glow of over 300 smartphone screens illuminating in unison. The wealthy elite, the politicians, the executives, They all scrambled to verify the impossible. The Vanguard Directorate was supposed to be a myth, a ghost story whispered in the highest, most classified circles of the intelligence community. My specific identity was heavily protected, buried beneath layers of impenetrable digital firewalls. However, typing the exact phrase Vanguard Architect Mackenzie into their secure search engines alongside Silas Thorne's public backing was more than enough to trigger the hidden algorithms. Within seconds, scattered gasps erupted from different corners of the room. "Oh my God," a prominent judge whispered, staring blankly at her glowing screen. "It is her. The anonymous ghost who rewrote the National Power Grid defense protocols last year." Another wealthy real estate developer choked on his breath. "The financial firewall of the Federal Reserve. The rumors said a single architect built it. It was her." The panicked, terrified whispers merged into a deafening roar of realization. They were reading obscured, redacted articles from top-tier cybersecurity journals, breathless accounts of an unnamed, legendary figure who practically held the digital keys to the modern world. And that legendary figure was currently sitting exactly where they had thrown their discarded dinner napkins. Through the sea of glowing screens and frantic chatter, my eyes found Julian. My golden, perfect, arrogant brother had been left completely stranded near the edge of the stage. He was staring at me, his face pale and completely devoid of its usual smug superiority. He looked physically diminished, as if the sheer weight of the truth had crushed his spine. The heavy, gold-plated senior partner title he had just received, the absolute pinnacle of his shallow existence, suddenly meant absolutely nothing. It was a meaningless, hollow grain of sand compared to the vast, terrifying ocean of true, absolute power I commanded from the shadows. Julian took a slow, trembling step backward, retreating from the spotlight he had fought so desperately to claim. The grand, multi-million-dollar honor gala designed to worship his corporate ascension had officially, brutally transformed. It was no longer his night. The magnificent ballroom had seamlessly shifted into a grand, terrifying stage built solely to honor the immense, undeniable power of the sister he had thrown away. The rest of the evening dissolved into a suffocating, unbearable awkwardness. Silas Thorne did not stay to enjoy the wreckage he had so effortlessly orchestrated. He offered me a single respectful nod, turned on his heel, and marched out of the grand ballroom, his private security detail flanking him in perfect military synchronization. The moment the heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, the absolute collapse of the gala commenced. The festive atmosphere completely evaporated into the cold air. The elite guests, deeply uncomfortable and thoroughly embarrassed by their earlier behavior, began to quietly filter out of the hall. The string quartet silently packed up their expensive instruments hours before their scheduled end time. Julian, utterly stripped of his golden aura and entirely overshadowed, stood frozen by the empty stage. His highly anticipated promotion had been reduced to an irrelevant footnote in the wake of the evening's explosive revelations. As for my father, he did not even have the courage to walk out through the main lobby. Hector quietly slipped away through the chaotic catering kitchen, exiting through the same back door designated for the garbage removal, carrying a heavy burden of absolute, crushing humiliation. The very next morning, I woke up feeling remarkably calm. At exactly 9 o'clock, I started my car and drove across town to Hector's sprawling suburban estate. I did not undertake this journey to gloat, to demand apologies, or to rub my immense success in his face. I went there to permanently sever the heavy, suffocating psychological knot that had tightly bound my chest for over 14 years. The massive mahogany front door was unlocked. I let myself in and walked down the quiet, impeccably decorated hallway, making my way to the exact same home office where I had been ruthlessly discarded so long ago. I expected to find a man bubbling with defensive anger or frantically trying to formulate a strategy to leverage my newly discovered power. Instead, I found a completely broken, exhausted old man. Hector was sitting rigidly in his heavy leather chair, staring blankly at the unlit fireplace. His face, usually so tight with arrogance and absolute control, sagged under the devastating weight of profound regret. He looked at me, his eyes entirely stripped of their usual judgmental fire. In a quiet, trembling voice, he confessed his deepest, ugliest flaws. He admitted that his vision had been entirely blinded by an obsessive, hollow pursuit of superficial glamour and societal approval. He whispered that his desperate hunger for status had caused him to blindly throw away the single most valuable diamond his family had ever possessed, trading it for cheap, polished glass. He began to offer a desperate, tearful apology, but I simply raised my hand to stop him. The grand emotional climax we both needed did not require a dramatic, drawn-out monologue. I did not hide my true identity for over a decade just to execute a cruel revenge against you, I said smoothly, my voice entirely steady and completely devoid of malice. I hid it because I desperately needed to know if my own father could simply love a normal, unremarkable daughter. I needed to see if I had any value to you without a massive salary or a heavily decorated business card. And your actions last night gave me my definitive, absolute answer. There was no cinematic reconciliation. There were no warm, tearful hugs, and I did not offer any instant, miraculous forgiveness. Reality is rarely that neat. I stood up from the guest chair, adjusted the strap of my simple purse, and turned toward the doorway. I stopped for one brief moment, looking back at the defeated man sitting in the shadows of his empty wealth. Love is never measured by corporate titles or bank accounts, Father, I said softly, leaving the words hanging in the quiet, dusty air of his office. When you are finally ready to sit down and share a simple meal with a perfectly normal Mackenzie, and not the chief director of Vanguard, you can call me. I walked out of that massive, silent house and stepped into the bright, warming sunlight. As I merged my car onto the open highway, driving straight toward the golden hues of the setting sun, I felt an incredible, undeniable lightness expanding within my chest. The heavy, invisible chains of my family's expectations had finally shattered. I realized, in that quiet, beautiful moment, that the sweetest, most satisfying revenge is never found in the toxic destruction of the people who hurt you. The ultimate triumph is simply walking completely free from the suffocating shadow of their narrow prejudices, taking back your power, and proudly defining your own absolute worth. Thank you so much to all our wonderful listeners for tuning into this story today. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's journey, please kindly consider helping us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description or the comment section. Your support is the only way we can pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating better, more engaging stories just for you. Thank you again, and take care.